due to the overflow of questions from last week and a whole new continent you're going to tackle today, I anticipate we'll use every bit of your hour. So we can start whenever you are ready to do
sure. Sure, we can get rolling.
Do you remember, so it was 2 weeks ago today, folks who were on that call, and there were a couple of questions and we were like, okay, save it for next time. Gary, do you remember where we left off? And perhaps you can address some of the outstanding things that we were talking about. So ladies and gentlemen, Gary Sainer.
Yeah, this is a continuation of discussion last time where we started to talk about UDI, and we focused on the US, some of the FDA regulations. A lot of questions going back and forth about how you implement it. We also touched on recent guidance that the FDA rolled out about class ones, and that class one provision or that guidance now has provision for those special class ones that are sold exclusively in the retail market, over the counter. You might find them at pharmacies and so on, even online through Amazon, whatever. But if they're sold online or if they're sold over the counter, then the provision is that they need to comply with UDI, except they do not have to submit a record to the FDA Good ID database. So we talked about that. That eases the pain for a number of those class one manufacturers. It also provides less visibility when that particular data set is used by various buyers. So if someone is using that Good ID database for some referencing or for looking at various vendors, competitive pricing, what would be available in the event of a shortage, you won't be there if you don't submit. So there's this business decision might be that you go ahead and submit anyway. From the bean counter financial people, they said, no, don't spend an extra penny. And then not realizing that there might be some good benefits of being able to use that for marketing. So that goes back and forth. The argument still rages, and it's going to be a different answer probably for every individual class one manufacturer.
I think from the very first time we met, which was, I think, 2014, you've been talking UDI.
I have. And
years.
It's a long history. We're going to find a wave here with the US, and that was because this third wave, class one, previously class 2-3s and class 2s have long been going as far as their compliance state. But you and I have been talking back and forth on this because the FDA keeps extending the deadline for the class ones. So we think we're up against the deadline, and industry shuffles. And that was back in 2018 for the first deadline for class ones. And then there was some questions about the quality of the data that was there, missing fields and so on. And the FDA extended it 2 years and said, please clean up your data. And when you submit class ones, please provide a good comprehensive set. And then 2020 rolled around and COVID hit, and then the FDA extended it 2 more years to this September.
Are you able to take what is pretty much a finished deck and just amend it by a date or two usually, or the guidance has changed so dramatically that you have to, completely change the presentation?
No, for those 2 changes, it was really, just change the 1 digit on the year and you're good, or the 2 digits on the year. Now, the most recent one that we talked about, Joe, is a little bit more complicated because this rollout of this class 1 provision, simultaneously with that, the FDA said, oh, well, we realize we're telling you kind of late in the game here, only a month or 2 before the September 24 deadline, and therefore we'll give you an extra 75 days to report in the event that you have to report. And that extension was across the board for all class ones. So it's now a 2-date thing for class ones. September 24, you need to comply with UDI. If you have direct marking, that would be required at that point. And there's some documentation that has to be in place. But then the 4th area of reporting, just that particular aspect needs to be done by December 8 of this year. So that now it's a little bit different. I did have to change my graphic on that.
Okay, fair enough.
All right, so let's get rolling. Well, first let me ask, any questions from the audience about anything that we didn't get to last time? I don't know, or if there's any remaining questions on US FDA, but
I have a question.
yeah, sure.
A former employee had a class 2 device, so it had to comply to with UDI. So what happened is you just print out a barcode and a human readable code and attach it anywhere near the original label. Is that allowed? I mean, it was meant as a temporary solution, but nothing as definite as temporary solutions.
Mhm.
Yeah, we've heard from the FDA that the actual UDI can be, well, it's typically part of a redesigned label. So if you did not have UDI before and you need to add it, then most likely companies will redesign their label and make accommodation for it. Some companies, and it's still a valid application implementation to put a second label, an additional label. It does need to be near the primary label that we normally are working with, but it can be a separate label. And I think that was what you described. And it only has the UDI information and perhaps the barcode. So the text presentation and the barcode, that's totally fine. Does that answer that question? Or
Yeah, and also because class 2 device has the serial number in the UDI, and it's also separate on the original label. So you can see that both belong together.
Yeah. So that presence of the serial number at any point on that label would mean that you need to make use of that serial number and put it into the full UDI in that production identifier section. Now, you said class 2, so that, conversation is applicable. Class 1s do not have to have any production identifiers. So if your product was class 1 and you had a serial number on the product, that's totally fine. But you would not need to include that in the UDI. So a lot of companies make use of the UPC, which is a little bit shorter and no provision for any production identifiers. But you said class 2, so it would definitely have to be included. All right. Anything else? Don't want to cut you off, but we'll get rolling otherwise.
Go ahead and restart your screen. I had shut it so we could.
Oh, okay.
Good morning, Paul.
I'm sorry, is it coming through now?
No, not yet. Go ahead.
Okay. Let me share. Yeah. Okay, you should see it now.
We certainly do. Thank you.
Oh, super. All right. So what we'll get started with is a high level. I like to think of this as going in the International Space Station and circling the globe and just peering down and see what's going on as far as UDI goes at a very high level. And then we'll come back and make some individual stops. We'll make a stop and hang out for a while in Brussels and for the European, it's where the commission is located there. So we'll, after our big tour around the world, we'll come back and do some really detailed. But what we have found is when we start to look at a global concept here for UDI, that it's not a point solution at the US. And it may have been a point, you felt like it was a point solution because that was the first rollout and the first health authority that came on board. But there have been a number of health authorities that rolled out UDI regulations, and a lot of them are in effect even now. There's another wave that I refer to them, and they're pending. There's a lot of talk and preparation in a number of additional health authorities, and eventually we're pretty much going to fill up this mat with red X's.
May I suggest, as your communications friend, to change your red X's to green check marks?
We could do that. So they're not out, they're in. Good comment.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's a whole host of them showing up here. Now, if we were to lay this out on a timeline, and it's a rigorous kind of activity to keep track of all these, but we take it upon ourselves to keep an eye on these things. If you lay out, going back to 2014, and the number of health authorities that had some activity in some previous years here, the US was the first health authority that had these requirements for class 3, the implantable life sustaining and life supporting, and also the class 2s. And Joe, this is the history that you and I had going way back, starting with this particular 3 waves. But there some other activity. These red dots appear with some other health authorities. They started to roll out some things. We won't go into that, but I'm going to leave this for homework. And there's 2 more of these slides to get up to present. So 2021 and 2022, a lot of activity last year and this year for China, and the European Union had some activity there. We're going to dive into that a little bit deeper. And South Korea is noteworthy. They started very early on, and actually in 2022, by that time they had done their class 3s, class 2s, and class 1s. So they're very advanced in their schedule. And last time we talked about this US FDA schedule down here near the bottom, where the September 1, and this is where I had to make my graphical change, Joe. I had to break out this to be 2 red dots. The first one of September for the labeling requirement, and then December 8, the 75 days later for the good ID reporting requirement. And if we look into the future, bad news here, your calendar gets really busy. So the red dots are starting to populate, big time here. We have seen most of the conversation centered around the European Union, only because it's such a big task and takes a lot of time. There's been some delays in this schedule, but we'll talk about those in a minute. And so we'll touch on some of the others as time permits, Australia, Saudi Arabia, and so on. But this gives you an idea of the points and the timing. I believe we can roll these challenges for UDI into 3 different categories. One of them is external to your company, and it has to do with the health authorities. Unfortunately, it's not nice, clear harmonization. The European Union did not do a cookie cutter of the FDA, nor did South Korea, China, whatever. It seems like all of them rearranged things and made it customized. There's some core commonality, but when you get down to the weeds, unfortunately, it's quite different. And there's a number of different problems there. Policies are different. The data specs themselves are different, various deadlines and so on. But the second bucket is internal. So the first one is external. You really don't have too much control over the health authority, but you do have some control over internal data management. And what we're finding is that this data had never really been assembled before, and it may not be fresh, may not be accurate, may be hard to find, there may be some omissions. So as you pull data together, you probably have walked down this pathway for the FDA, but when you go to other regions, it's going to be a repeat story. So it won't be quite as bad. You kind of know what you're doing, but it's not just, just do a redo. Unfortunately, there are enough variances when you go to different health authorities that you have to closely walk down that pathway. Now, the third bucket is that the scope changes. So it really cranks up to be many different health authorities. And for those global manufacturers that are in the audience, this is starting to be, if not already, a real challenge into keeping up and following the schedule, following the specs, and so on. Independent of that, in the bottom right-hand corner here is the customers. These are those trading partners that you actually sell product to. It might be something called a group purchasing organization, retailers, health care providers, and so on. I'm going to touch on that in a second. But the bottom line here, the takeaway is that, unfortunately, an ideal utopia type of one global UDI policy and data set, it's just not happening. And because of the complexity, a lot of companies are looking at some tools and processes to handle this under a holistic type of a master management. Now, I'm going to touch on this customer aspect, where many times we're finding product information such as the e-catalog of your portfolio be reported by way of a network, something called the GS1 Global Data Synchronization Network. It's a structured network used in other industries, groceries, retail. Walmart uses it, Amazon uses it. And so you see these group purchasing organizations and some of these large retailers like the Walmarts of the world. And there's some groups of early adopters in the healthcare providers. So, the Mayo Clinic and some of these other more technically advanced manufacturer or healthcare providers all do this. So I'm going to stop here because this question has kind of become hot and then cooled off a little bit. I'd like the audience to jump in here and say, first of all, have you had this request from your buyers to supply electronic information by way of GDSN? And then secondly, how did you react to that? How did that question get answered? So let me stop there.
Anyone? Gary, today we largely have, oh, David, you have something?
Oh yeah, thanks for letting me. I was not a question per se, but I'm really intrigued by this because a light went off with me that this is a business opportunity. And so it's a huge opportunity. I mean, in terms of amount of work and the scope of everything. It's just really it's really a comment, and my talent-o-meter has clicked on, and I'm curious to hear what others say, but I look at this as maybe a potential business opportunity for development of a proprietary software that can reach out, pull this all stuff together. So,
Gary, if there's someone who has software, it'd be you guys, right?
Yeah, well, this we actually have a platform that supports this because manufacturers approached us early on and said, I have to report a whole bunch of information to the FDA and the regulatory body, but now I also have to share it with my trading partners. And there is an overlap of some information. And now they want to have some official UDI type of attributes included. And this is not a new concept. It's just been growing over the course of time. But now with UDI in play, it does add a new element and a lot of additional churn and interest. I think there was someone that had a comment.
I think you can continue.
Okay. All right. So if anybody jumps in or comes across this, please forward it. We're always interested in seeing how this plays out. All right, we need to get off, this International Space Station at very high level, and re-enter the atmosphere and get into the discussion on the European Union. So, for those in the audience, and I think this is, just a quick recap. I'll drive through this really quickly. There was this medical device regulatory forum, and there were some problems with regulatory in the European arena. And at that time, and still kind of still in play, there were a number of directives. Directives are able to be implemented with a little bit of variation at each member state. So each country can meet the intent of a directive, but you'll see many different policies. And there was 3 of them in place. In 2017, the European Union rolled out 2 regulations. Noteworthy is that these are now regulations legally binding across all the member states. So the good news here is that there is commonality. So the letter of the law here needs to be adhered to by each country. The bad news is it completely cleared the table as far as the regulatory framework. And this is quite different than the way the FDA rolled out UDI in the US. FDA simply layered on an additional requirement for UDI. All the other approval processes, the registration of establishment, listing and everything for products, there was no change. It did not touch any of those rules. And it just said, oh, by the way, you also have to do UDI. That's not the situation in Europe. And there is so much to do. I really feel for manufacturers when they need to conform to this, because there's hundreds of things to be involved with, and it's keeping your market keeping your product on the market. There's a lot of activities. No products were able to be grandfathered in, so everything has to be reevaluated. The European Commission offers this item 9 on the list, and they call it the execute the master implementation plan. Well, unfortunately, that's not one item. That's about 10 more sub items, little sub projects, and unfortunately, we can't have enough time to talk about these on the list here. we're going to talk a little bit about the UDI, and some of the registration. So with time allotted, we'll move into that. Now, we also need to be aware of the new platform comes a new database. So there are a number of modules. So this is the brand new framework. This is hopefully a recap for those people. So I'll just walk through the 6 modules here. One is to register your company, called an economic operator. There's actors that are being referred to. And then the one that is most closely aligned to the FDA Good ID database, there's a UDI and devices module. There's another module for certificates, notified bodies, and you go down the list: clinical investigations, vigilance, and market surveillance. So there's a number of stakeholders involved in those, but we're going to focus in on the second one. Now, the access to this UDIMED is to be open to the public. And that's different than the predecessor of this UDIMED database. It was primarily closed, really just member states, the competent authorities were able to access the information, but now they want to make this highly visible to the public. All right, so we have the structure in place, brand new platform. Next question people ask, well, what's the timing of all this? So we have these 6 modules, and to follow their development, the FDA or the European Commission did not roll out all those simultaneously. It's kind of a staggered development effort. The first one is already open for voluntary since 2020. So in December of 2020, you could register your company. And then the one, closest to the discussion today is this device module, and that, along with the certificate model, was open in October of 2021 for voluntary production submissions. As of I looked a couple weeks ago, it has 96,000 records already in that production database, so it's up and running. And then the other 3 modules, they're still in development, and they're way behind. So most recently, the European Commission again extended the date out here. So there's something referred to as the European Commission notice that says the UDIMED is fully functional. And now that's targeted for probably the end of 2024, or excuse me, the second quarter. And then there, by regulation, is a 6-month delay, let the dust settle. And then the mandatory use of this database becomes required across all 6 modules. And that's a significant date. That marks the beginning of some mandatory provisions, one of which is the mandatory registration. So you could voluntarily submit early, but now it's going to be required. There's an 18-month window, some conditions. And then at the end of that, anything going forward, you certainly need to register your product. So this is pretty messy. The US did not have all these different modules, all these different functions, but to understand where UDI fits in, we need to understand the platform and the context.
Very,
so for those that, go ahead.
I was under the impression that for post-market surveillance, you have to fill it in 2024, but you do it from every post-market surveillance since 2021. So you also have to put your backlog in it. Is that correct? Or is that?
Well, the surveillance, there's some activities that need to be done according to the regulations, but you don't have a module to report them to. So it won't be open, the surveillance, market surveillance module and the vigilance module, more importantly, like your MIR reports, your manufacturing incident reports, there's no database to accept them until now, the end of 2024
Yeah, but you still have to fill in those reports from the past years when the database gets opened.
Yeah, so there is ongoing requirements. You just can't turn that function off. There's provisions to keep the directive requirements in place, and none of that adverse event reporting or serious incident reporting goes away. It needs to continue. So you're right. It just becomes a matter of where you put it and how you store it and what you adhere to. Now, for those people that like charts, this is the very same information, but in a chart format. So we see some check boxes off here on some of the first three modules, voluntary, or excuse me, there's two environments I should mention. There's a playground environment, unofficial data, where new features are usually rolled out, and then there's the production. So the last two columns. So playground has been rolled out on a number of modules, and production, only the actor at UDI and insert modules, those three have now opened up their doors. So same information, just laid out a little bit differently. One of the other aspects and differences when you move to the European Union is to understand your portfolio might actually fall into three different buckets, as I refer to them, three different categories. You might have products that were placed on the market under a directive, and now, well, as of the date of application of a particular regulation, you don't sell it, or you don't place that product anymore. You don't sell it, you don't commercially distribute it. It basically stops. And there's many reasons for that. Some companies look at the profitability or the scope and the the challenge of trying to have that device eventually be meeting all the regulation requirements, and they said, no, we're not going to do it. It's not worth it, and we pull it off or whatever. So that you might have some items in your portfolio that actually have an end of life. The second bucket, and this is certainly the largest right now, where you might have a number of products that have a directive certificate associated with them, and they are able to be continued. So there's kind of this legacy grace period, if you will, this transition, and that keeps moving around and being extended. But this particular window allows you to continue to manufacture products under the certificate. And the news here is that, you know, this has a deadline. It's not going to exist forever. So there's a cliff, there's an approaching cliff, and you have to make a decision. You know, what are you going to do? You're going to stop this particular product line, or are you going to take the very same product and have it meet the regulations? So there's just a stricter threshold, another new fresh evaluation. If it needs to have notified body review, then you need to have that scheduled and work all through that. So your exact same product can be applied and put into you know, this MDR medical device regulation category. And that's called an equivalent device. So you don't make any design changes, physically the same, everything's identical, but now it meets the regulations. You might have to do some additional tests and get the technical documentation in place for that particular evaluation. Your other option is to take your legacy device and say, you know what, I have not been able to make any design changes for 3 or 4 years, and I have a lot of new improvements that I'd like to roll out. So when I have my notified body come in and evaluate my product for a competitive edge, I want to add these new features. I think it's going to be great. So in that particular case, you might have additional safety or performance, other technical documents to prepare. So it might take you a little bit longer to add all those enhancements to your legacy product and then have that enhanced product released under the MDR. So you have a couple options there, but the legacy device that almost, I'd say 90% of the market is currently using, that's going to have an end of life, and there's going to be a cliff where that drops off. So let's take a look at that timing. On the bottom here, we have something called date of applications for the MDR and the IVDR when a lot of these regulations come into effect. We already talked about this voluntary registration period and the mandatory registration period, so nothing new there. For legacy devices, here's your timeline. So you can continue to place those legacy devices with a valid certificate onto May 2024. So it's just 3-year extension period. And then there's some sell-off down through the supply chain, but you're unable to place it on the market anymore. The lighter band that I just added is for medical device or those devices that meet the medical device regulation. So these are regulation devices. So you can start putting, actually going back a year ago, year and a couple months, back in May of 2021, if you had a class 1 medical device, you did have to do that self-certification by the date of application. So for you to continue to place that particular class 1 on the product, this should be old news. You know, you definitely should have done this a year ago. And then there are some requirements for placing UDI on labels. So it's scheduled by risk class 3s, class 2s, and class 1s. This is a kind of a schedule, kind of like the FDA did, but it's layered on a little bit differently. And then there may be some requirements to place UDI on the actual product. So this is direct marking here at the top level. So the screen gets a little busy here with all these schedules and timings, and it's a real tough for a company to figure out a strategy of how they migrate their legacy out of or how do they migrate their products out of the legacy into MDR compliance. Now, we won't take the time to go into it, but this whole conversation needs to be repeated for in vitro diagnostics, and the scheduling, the timing is unique for that particular group. For those that like the chart, here's your chart. And you just simply look up, particular device class. Do you have a medical device or an in vitro diagnostic, and look at the dates for reporting, the dates for UDI on the label, and in the event that there's direct marking, there you go. So any quick questions on that before we move on? I stop there. How's this fleshing out for those manufacturers in the audience? Are you able to meet these dates? Do you have plans in place? What's the deal?
And if you are a consultant, of course, and you're helping a manufacturer, if you could answer on their behalf.
Yeah, could I, David, real quickly, could I see the previous slide one more time? I was
Sure.
trying to check. There's yeah, okay. I was looking, the IVD one has gotten really confusing, and I made the correction on that. So yeah.
So you bring up IVD, and there was this issue about. Let's first of all, the quick background that I'm aware of is that only about 10% of IVDs need to have a notified body involved in their certificate. So almost all of it was self-certified. With the regulation, it kind of flip-flopped.
Yeah.
Now 85% need to have a notified body. So it's a huge amount of work.
Right.
And plus there's no precedent. There's no long-standing education. No one can say, oh, I've been doing this 5 years. That's not the case. This is going to be really tough. So the European Commission provided some extension for those products that are going to need a certificate for the first time. I nicknamed the first certificate group, and they go way out. So this was extended 2025, 2026, and 2027 to try to ease the pain. But this, in my opinion, kind of kicks the can down the road. I don't know that it really solves it. We really need a lot more notified bodies that are able to be designated for IVD evaluation. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree. Are you asking me? Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree with you. The things I'm finding are kind of two broad categories. The first time that many of these companies are dealing with a notified body, and there's that learning that occurs there. And then the other thing would be actually putting together a submission, which they're not used to doing, in a sense, to have it and then have it really scrutinized, by an independent group in order to facilitate market entry.
So I think the European Commission needs to roll out a number of quotes, the new regulations and guidance documents so that people know what they need to conform to. And then secondly, there's education on behalf of the manufacturer to understand what the heck they are. And then thirdly, the notified body needs to understand it and apply those rules to individual products. So it's a huge task.
I always keep the law behind me here for the IVD, and it's significant, especially when you start adding in some relevant guidance documents and things like that. And so, this IVD stack goes from here to like here. You throw in all the the guidance doc is just incredible and hugely challenging. You know, on the one hand, opportunities for those of us in the industry, but consultants, but man.
Yeah, I feel for those people that need to figure this out. It's a pretty big challenge.
So I just have a funny, listening to you, right? This is your second session. Like I had no idea what UDI was. And I'm a supply chain guy, right? So I don't need to know, but I do now. I mean, you're going to make me sound very smart. Like, guys, you have to, we see, you know, class 1 and 2 prospects, you know, product companies every now and then, but I definitely, for the startup guys, be like, have you figured this out? And not just in the US, you know?
Yeah,
so,
right.
Thank you.
Gary,
Thank you.
Paul showed up thinking he was going to learn about birth control. So imagine.
Exactly, you know, I didn't want to go there, but you're right. You took the words out of my mouth.
Hey, I want to make
sorry.
a comment on the standards and guidance documents. The people that are trying to write those are running into this HAS review where they're delaying standards and guidance documents from going out because they have decided it needs a lot more information that the people writing the standards don't know anything about. So that's been that's going to make it a little more difficult too for people since they're not allowing the standards to be published.
Ideally, yeah, it would have been nice to have a lot more guidance and clearance right up front, but man, it almost seems like the European Commission is trying to figure it out as time marches on here, and it comes back and bites them.
It's a wonder the EU has any medical devices at all. I mean,
Well, they've been under this directive for years,
Yeah.
but you know, they had this really ambitious goal of changing the complete framework, and I understand the reasons for that. But my goodness, it almost seemed like they needed to do another 3-year specification and, you know, user feedback before they rolled something out. And then because of times and political pressure, I think they try to meet some deadlines. And then they realize, oh my goodness, what we did here is not going to work in reality. You know, people started to put real data in it, and it doesn't work very well.
Yeah, when you think about just the IVD, it's like the worst case scenario. There's 7, notified bodies, you know, under IVDR now, and you got, and that's a huge market. I mean, you know this from a supply chain standpoint, Paul and others on the call here. It's incredible. There'll be some. Yeah, I'm just saying it's a huge challenge.
Yeah, without a doubt.
You
All right,
know,
go ahead.
just one more, the comment you made about how Europe is, you know, so much far behind. I'm hearing the other side of that conversation and narrative from product companies and investors in Europe saying that I have a product company now, right, that is launching, and I'm shocked that they're launching both in the US and Europe simultaneously, but the investors are saying, go develop a beachhead in the US first, because that's going to increase our valuation and acceptance of and ability to sell in the European market after they've proven who they are and what they can do, and the user acceptance in the US. It's crazy.
Yeah, now that's a total flip-flop from, you know, even like 2 or 3 years ago, right? You know, launch it in Europe and then bring it to the US.
Yeah, I think it's even stronger. I mean, what the European consultants are advising is first go to US, and the reason why is the process is predictable. And once you get through to US, that's puts certain pressure on the European notified bodies to go ahead and certify you because you're already certified in the US. And so I think the general advice now is US first, even if you're only looking at a European market.
Yeah,
Agree.
Now let's touch on some of the differences. You know, we kind of, you know, started to bring that into the conversation between the US and EU. I called this up, and there's a list of production identifiers, and I put an asterisk behind the manufacturing date here, because this is slightly different than what the US FDA rule is. Here, the manufacturing date only needs to be included in the UDI if it's the only production identifier on the label. Otherwise, it doesn't have to be there. And that conditional little clause there is, you don't find that in the US. The US says if manufacturer date is on the label, black and white, it's got to be in the UDI production identifier. So that little nuance. The other difference is that European Commission explicitly mentioned software ID. Now the FDA allowed software ID, or actually recommend, let me take that back, required software ID to be embedded in the batch number, the lot and batch number value, had to have the software ID in the event you had software as a medical device. But the European Commission carves out software ID as a separate production identifier. And I did have a question for those that might have touched on it, and I don't know if anyone in the audience has a little bit of history with software ID for European Union. How do you plan to capture that in the production identifier? Are you going to make use of the lot and batch identifier for a G10? This would be a code 10, or there's actually another 4-digit application identifier in the GS1 standard, happens to be 8012, 4 digits, which is specifically identified for software. So is there anyone in the audience that has any experience with this software ID for Europe? I know it's a very niche type of a question. I'm not too surprised that no one's going there yet. All right, so let's move on. I talked about some of the requirements for the EU. In this quadrant we put together for the US and the EU is pretty much the same. The label, slight variations in some details, but for the most part, the label requirement is the same. The direct mark is similar, but notably different, where the European Commission uses the word reusable, and they imply that if it's used by the same patient, direct marking may apply. Now, the FDA says only if it's used by different patients. So there's a difference. If you're making a product selling to the US and the EU, and then all of a sudden now the EU requires you to have direct marking because you intend it to be used on the same patient. Or the other difference here is European Commission says if the product is subject to cleaning, disinfection, sterilization, or refurbishing between uses. Now, the FDA only has 2 of those items in the list. They only say if it's high disinfection or sterilization. But maybe, and again, this is the frustrating part. What the heck does cleaning mean? Is that soap and water? And if so, you now might have to have direct marking required on your European products, but not on the US. And as a manufacturer, now you have 2 streams of manufacturing. You can actually voluntarily put do a single stream and voluntarily put direct marking on the US, but it just becomes all of a sudden a different requirement. And that's what drives manufacturers nuts, is trying to figure all this nuance out. How do you folks in the audience see some of these nuances changing, what has to be done?
I'll wait till someone else talks, because
There's also the problem that on your devices, you don't have enough room to put all the information on.
Yep.
So you're going to make a choice. What do I put on? And as a manufacturer, you think traceability is paramount. So if you can identify the manufacturer, and if you can identify the serial number or anything like that with an UDI, then that's the minimum.
Yeah, without a doubt.
I was going to say, Gary, with this reusable, this is a whole separate science right now in this arena, because we've got such an expansion and growth of these devices being placed on the market that can be used, by the same patient, by the different patient, or whatever. And manufacturers are under the under the gun to try to come up with a reusable IFU manual, that goes with the product that you follow. And then it's up to you to verify, as who's ever doing this, to verify that you're following this procedure.
Yeah.
So all I can say is it's more than just soap and water, like you said.
Yeah, it's a little bit tough.
Science.
All right, so thanks for those comments. We'll take a look at the other 2 quadrants here on the right. The reporting to the European database. So this is the equivalent of the FDA global UDI database, Good ID. But again, some major complexity comes into play here. There is this concept of a basic UDI DI, which is nicknamed Buddy, but it's a grouping identifier, a family identifier. And that was a brand new concept with the European Union. The FDA had no type of a concept like that. So when you figure that in and look at all the additional attributes, the 64 data elements that you were collecting for the EU now bumps up to 111 data attributes. So almost twice the number of attributes that need to be reported. So this is another challenge getting that data. We'll take a quick look at that in a second. And then the other difference, I'll just quickly run through here, the patient implant card and the retention of records now can be quite lengthy. 10 years, we assume that UDI information is part of the technical documents. So, and then 15 years for implants. So European Union is very, very cautious based on some bad history here of keeping records. They're forcing this to be in play. If we take a look at a label, some of the things that are new for the European Union, there's this MD symbol here in the center. This is, for medical device. There's a lot more information about translating and providing warnings. There's a little bit more emphasis on the electronic information of use, going to a website. And then for our discussion here, the requirement that UDI is in place. Now, if companies had been using some standards, such as GS1 or HIPIC, they're able, they're well prepared. So they already have this in place. Many of them have adopted it for the US and now carried over. So sometimes this is a no-brainer. Other times it's a brand new challenge, like, oh my goodness, we never used that. And now it needs to be in place. The two-tier data records, we'll just quickly take a look at that. At the high level, there's a number of attributes that need to be recorded at the what they refer to as the basic UDI level. So you have some identification for that. And then there's a whole host of additional fields at the individual device level. So this gets pretty rigorous to walk through and make sure you meet all these individual requirements. I just wanted to show you a quick example here of a buddy and how it's different than a individual device identifier. So I'm using GS1 only because it's so common here for the example, but you're familiar with this 14-digit G10 down at the bottom in its presentation with the UDI. A buddy is constructed using your very same company prefix and no additional charge. That's the good news. But then you need to come up with a model reference number and run that set of characters through a algorithm, a calculator. It comes up with a 2 check digits, not 1, but 2 check digits. So, and then there's never a barcode connected with this. So this data is not on the label. It's only for documentation and for identification inside the database. I'll show a graphic here. We're getting a little short in time, but you see that in the upper left, I have a buddy, a group identifier. And then underneath that, I have these plastic forceps. And again, there might be a packaging level and other forceps. I might have stainless steel forceps. I might have stainless steel locking and so on. But this can be at a minimum of 1 device inside each buddy group, but it can have thousands, 10,000s if it meets the criteria. So there's some reasons not to make them so big, but we won't go into that right now. All right, so we did promise that we're going to swing around the world. I have note cards on about 4 or 5 companies. We'll just flash through those note cards. And this is the layout of the note card. There's events in the upper left. There's some compliance timing that you need to be aware of. And then on the right are some details. So this should look very familiar. We talked a lot about this last time. This is the summary for the European Union. The 2 dates that are, well, 3 dates here that are most applicable. Starting in October of 2021, you can start voluntarily registering your UDI. And this is an official registration. And then May of this year, the in vitro diagnostics had the self-certification deadline. And a year ago, this should be old news. Your MDR class 1s were needed to be. And then looking forward, this mandatory 18-month reporting period, end of 2024, going out to the middle of 2026. Now, this looks like it's really far away. We have noticed that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And we suggest you start firming up and collecting and cleansing data. And if you don't plan to submit for a year, it's good to put it in a structured area database and apply the business rules and see how you're doing, so that you're ready to submit later on. But this is the wisdom here. The comment is, don't let the time march on, and then you'll be caught with 3 months to go, and it's impossible for your company perhaps to react in 3 months, depending on your volume and so on. I don't think there's anything noteworthy over here. We talked about the new regulations. We talked about Buddy. Down here at the bottom, I mentioned 3 bolded items. The standards are slightly different than the US. They add a 4th one, the IFA, which is a standard from the pharmacy arena, where medical device sold to pharmacies have a code in German-based pharmacies. But anyway, that's a legal 4th one. And the DUNS number that we have all been familiar with in the US is not used by the European Union. They apply a new number called a single registration number to each of the actors. And the other little kicker is the global medical device nomenclature is not used, but a European version with totally different structure called the European medical device nomenclature is used. So that it's another little twist just to keep things interesting. So we're going to take a look at some of the other ones. South Korea, the news here is if you're selling into South Korea, this should be water over the dam. You should have already complied all 4, 3, 2, and 1 classes. Unique in South Korea is what I refer to as track and trace. They call it a supply report. And then every month you need to report about 10 metrics for data that are imported into South Korea. So this is over and above UDI. This is separate and ongoing on a regular basis. But that's quite different than some of the other health authorities that we're taking a look at. There's 40 or so attributes, and I guess maybe that's the noteworthy things there. Quick comment on China. They had 2 batches, something called a batch 1 and batch 2. Batch 2 was just due a month or so ago, June of 2022. And then there's no schedule in place for the remaining class 2s and class 1s. So we're kind of keeping an eye on China to see what's going to happen. But they do have electronic submissions. Noteworthy for both South Korea and China is that you need to have local in-country representation be part of your compliance. So they need to create some accounts in the local repositories. Let's quickly touch on Saudi Arabia here. We have been very impressed with the progress that Saudi Arabia is making. They went silent there for a while, and it looked like they were going to follow the European Union. Whatever European Union rolled out, they were going to a year later. Does not appear to be the case. It looks now like they said, you know what, European Union has made so many delays. They're in a quandary. We're going to advance and develop our database. Oh, excuse me. This is Saudi Arabia. Let me go down here. Australia. Australia was making really good progress. So they recently just rolled out an Australian sand pit, and that is available for some testing. So you can do some voluntary work there. And then as early as January of next year, there might be some voluntary requirements. So very impressed with the TGA group and some of the activities that they're done. We're a member of a technical group there to try to keep an eye on what's going on and do some testing. But keep an eye on Australia. I don't think they'll wait around much longer. They're moving and very competent. Let me back up to the Saudi Arabia. This is a slide I had up. But Saudi Arabia had made some progress. They have a voluntary user interface. They have not quite figured out how to import a spreadsheet for an upload yet, and they keep delaying this. There's been 2 delays. The current delay has the dates going out to September of 2023. So they use letters for their classes, the high risk being D. So D, B, and C are all due next year in September, and then class A the year later in 2024. So it's similar type of concept, but there's been significant delays in implementing it. Again, in-country representation is used. And I think that's going to wrap it up. We're at the hour here. Joe, if there's questions, if people want to, try to dig some things up online, we offer a lot of resources, and as always, you can get a hold of me and try to answer some questions. Thank you very much.
It's not lost on me that you wore a blue shirt today, by the way.
Okay, I wanted to make sure you were aware of that. Yeah, I'm running it through the washer. I'm gonna have to get a whole bunch of new blue shirts because you're wearing me out.
Funny.
I love it though. I live and breathe this stuff. I find it pretty exciting. All right, so I am a nerd. All right, I'll take.
No, Gary, your passion is palpable. It's amazing. It's really, really cool to watch you present. Really get it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, glad to share all this with you folks. Anything else? Any questions there before we close out?
Really, I would just tell folks, and I think they know this. If you have a question about UDI, he's your guy. I mean, as I've often said, there's a lot that I don't know, but as long as I know a guy or a gal who know the answer, then we're pretty safe as long as we stay in the family. Am I right? Let's see.
Yeah, that does help.
Next week, I think, is Medi's week. Let's just double check. Yep. He's going to talk about direct-to-patient marketing for small medical device companies. And we have a full September coming through as well. So stay tuned. And for those of you who want a little time on camera and share with us what you know, I'm happy to do that. Enjoy your week. And I'll see you next week, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Nice to see you all. Take care.